The first thing we're going to look at is Ben Hur, a novel which is certainly a great historical novel and Christian novel, and as you probably know, was turned into a very good and popular movie. I would argue that the novel Ben Hur is not particularly realistic. I don't mean by that it seems like a fantasy or it doesn't seem true, but that it does not fit into the literary genre called realism. With the Industrial Revolution and the rise of large cities in America, the late 19th century, which Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, was not only a time of prosperity for some people and poverty for a lot of people, a lot of progress and changing of American life. Realism, appropriately enough, replaced Romanticism as a major, the major, I should say, literary concept of the time. Even writers who are not in our book, like William Dean Howells, Frank Norris, who I did my dissertation on, Theodore Dreiser, were big names of the time that stressed the idea of realism and that we should, as our book more or less defines it, faithfully depict real life, rather than the romantic, symbolism-driven, fantasy-driven, often highly emotional and unreal world, except, I think, inside the human heart and mind itself, of the earlier 19th century writers we've looked at, like Hawthorne, Poe, Melville. Although Melville, I'd say, is somewhat a realistic writer, too. Just like Romanticism, realism was being reflected across the Atlantic by European writers. French writers like Flaubert and Zola were very much realistic writers, for example, and Frank Norris, the American, admired them especially and tried to imitate them. And I would say that there is nothing in Lew Wallace that is local color in the American sense, certainly. Not only Ben Hur, but from what little I know about them, other novels he wrote were also historical novels in exotic settings. I know that he was actually the governor of Indiana Territory at one point, so he did a lot of different things. He had an interesting, varied life, sort of like Captain John Smith's and some other swashbuckling people in American history. But Ben Hur really changed his life. He simply wanted to fully research Jesus' time, the world of Palestine and the Roman Empire that Jesus was born into, as the Bible says, when the fullness of time had come. As the beginning of the Gospel of Luke tells us, the time when Caesar Augustus was emperor of Rome and Pontius Pilate had taken over in Judea. What Wallace was trying to do, somewhat like St. Luke did, was to set this place firmly in history, or I should say set Christ's birth firmly in history, give a sense of the historical surroundings of it, and give as strong a sense as he could of what life was really like and the Eastern world was like in those days. The interesting thing that happened, as our book points out, is his study of the Bible and his study of Jesus' life led him to become a believer by the time he had finished Ben Hur. God works in mysterious ways, as the hymn says, and in Lew Wallace's life, God actually got through to him through his sincere desire to write a realistic novel about Jesus. Our book mentions the huge success of Ben Hur without even mentioning the movie. Of course, it was one of the movies that made a star of Charlton Heston in the 50s. It was an enormous success, as was the book. The movie focuses on the spectacle, of which there is a great deal in the novel, scenes that in fact are not in the section of the book that we are reading. The galley slave scenes, the chariot race, which is the most famous one of all, and of course the scenes of Jesus' life, which Judah ben Hur, the Jewish Roman hero of the novel, he keeps running into Jesus. In fact, in the book, it's amazing how often he runs into him at all the important points of his ministry, at least some of the most important ones. His baptism by John the Baptist, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and of course the key event of his life on earth, the crucifixion. And this is the climax of the film as well. Ben Hur is a historical novel. We've looked at several historical novels, and I haven't, I think, fully discussed where the concept came from. Sir Walter Scott was an excellent early practitioner of it. Scott, certainly a romantic, not a realist, but as a Scottish writer of the border. James Fenimore Cooper, whom we have looked at this year, you'll remember was an American practitioner of that, as he put his hero Natty Bumppo in with the American Indians and the events of the early colonial times, or I should say the later colonial times, the early settler expansion times as well, all the way out to the prairie where we are, where I still am, and the eventual pushing aside of the Indians. All of this, of course, is American history. What Lew Wallace was doing was writing Christian history, and at the same time, as we can see from the Bible, that so often means the history of Israel, the history of the Roman Empire, and the world into which Jesus came. Judah Ben Hur is another person of that world. And what the book does mostly successfully, I think there are some ways in which it looks artificial and doesn't blend as well as it might. What the book sets out to do is to intersect its hero's life with the life of its real hero, the Son of God and Son of Man and our Savior, to show what an impact it had on a believing Jew of that world who believed in the prophecies of the Messiah to come. But as we can also see in the Gospels, many Jews did not believe in that in the way that Jesus actually did come. And the discussions of that make up a lot of the second reading that you're going to do later on. The first and the second reading, as our book tells us, it says it's from Book 4. It's not just a portion of Book 4, it's pretty much all of Book 4, except for a couple of scenes depicting a Roman orgy that Messala, Ben Hur's former friend and betrayer, holds as a host. As we read through, or as I hope you already have read through, the first part of the reading having to do with Ben Hur, Simonides, his father's former servant, Esther, Simonides' daughter, Moloch, the man that Simonides sends to spy on Ben Hur, and finally Messala. That part of the reading does not seem to deal with Jesus at all, and there are very large portions of the novel that don't. What I'm going to do is try to lead you through the entire structure of the novel and how it is connected to Jesus' life. The idea that the three wise men, and why do we think they were three? Because they brought three gifts, rode up on camels during the night of Jesus' birth, were beside Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in the stable with the shepherds, is of course a popular image. We see it in creches, we see it in Christmas cards. Most likely there were a great many of these men. They were probably astrologers or educated Jews or maybe Gentiles from far in the east, perhaps from Babylon. They came a long way. They must have had a large retinue. and they probably met Jesus and the Holy Family long after his birth, sometime between his babyhood and the flight into Egypt. But Lew Wallace presents it completely in the traditional way. He presents three wise men in the desert who have come together to follow the star, and he shows them going to the cave. There actually is a cave in Bethlehem underneath the present church where tourists go to see the place where Jesus perhaps was born. It shows them going there and presenting the gifts and adoring him, and his parents looking on. The key thing about the three wise men from Lew Wallace's point of view is that he not only makes them Gentiles, that is, non-Jews, non-believers, at least from cultures that were not believers in the one true God, but he makes them represent three great cultures of that day that did not believe in the biblical God: Egyptians, Greeks, and Hindus. Lew Wallace makes a major character mainly of Balthazar, the Egyptian, whom we see in our first reading as Messala nearly runs over him and his daughter Iris with the team of horses. There'll be a lot more about both Balthazar and Iris in the book. And following that, we move into Ben Hur's life in Book 2 and Book 3, and that's the story that perhaps you know from the movie, where Ben Hur is a rich young man. His father had a fleet of ships. He left a lot of wealth. He lives with his mother and sister, whom he greatly loves. He, or I believe his sister, accidentally knocks a tile onto the head of Gratus, Pilate's predecessor as procurator of Judea. This is the real inciting incident which starts the story. Why does Ben Hur hate Messala so much? Why do the words, "the driver was Messala," appear so melodramatically in the book, in italics? Because Messala, who is Ben Hur's Roman friend, and has just decided in a conversation depicted in the book that Ben Hur is too Jewish and too believing in the Jewish God and in the Jewish people's political and religious hopes to be his friend. Messala is there when the soldiers come in. He could easily have said something that helped Ben Hur, that said he was innocent. Instead, he says he doesn't know him, he doesn't know anything about him. Ben Hur, his mother and sister are dragged off to captivity, their household taken by Gratus, and the hero's real adventures of the novel begin.
God, help me.
You! I said no water for him!
Ben Hur and Jesus are the same age, so at this point both men are perhaps 20 years old. Following this scene in Book 3, we have the familiar story of Ben Hur as a galley slave chained to the oars along with other men, and finally saving the life of the Roman soldier who is in charge of the ship when the ship has been sunk. This is what takes us to the beginning of our reading. Ben Hur's fortunes change completely now. He becomes a Roman citizen. He has been adopted by Arius. Arius has died, so Ben Hur comes back to Antioch to the east. Eventually, he's going to come all the way back to Israel because he's looking for his mother and sister. He doesn't know what has become of them, and that is the reason he is meeting Simonides, the man whose meeting, other than the scene on the boat where he first hears about Simonides and his torture, the man who is meeting with Ben Hur is the first significant event of the part of the book that we are reading. There's a lot more to come, not only in our reading, but in the entire novel Ben Hur. We will continue working our way through it in 4 more videos, and we'll continue showing you what I can find of that classic film as well.